we're back in the car on a Friday, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank all of you for spending some of your early Friday afternoon here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, there's a couple of movie anniversaries. There's a 34 years ago today and a 35 years ago today. But we're going to do the 35 years ago today because the other film, which would be Catherine Bigelow's really fantastic action thriller Point Break, I've talked about it a couple of times. It's one of those movies that comes up a lot. If you mention Patrick Swayze, if you mention Keanu or Gary Busey or Catherine Bigelow. The movie that came out 35 years ago today, on this day, 1990. In a pretty stacked movie summer where the same filmmaker, Rennie Harlin, also did Die Hard 2, and you had Warren Beatty and Dick Tracy. You had Tom Cruise in Days of Thunder. It was just a really stacked summer. There were some big hits. There were some big swings and misses. But on this day, 1990, Andrew Dice Clay's attempt at film superstardom, The Adventures of Ford Fairlane, opened in theaters. Now, the backstory, if you want to say a little bit of personal backstory, because I did mention and talked about this movie as part of the Guilty Pleasure series, but we're not going to, yes, this movie is a guilty pleasure, but that's not really what we got to talk about. It's not really what I want to talk about. I grew up a fan of stand-up comedy. From a very young age, I was always fascinated by comedians, and without necessarily saying to myself, why are certain things funny to me and not to other people? I didn't really go that deep. I was a little kid, but I was interested, and we had kind of a tradition at home. My dad was a big stand-up comedy fan, used to watch all of the HBO comedy specials, and so I was interested in all kinds, whether it was the sort of safe G and PG rated stand-up comedy or firebrands such as George Carlin, Eddie Murphy, Richard Pryor. My parents tried to keep a bit of a leash on me when it came to which stand-up comedians was I really allowed to watch, but I kind of didn't listen to them and often watched stuff that I really wasn't old enough, and there were a lot of references. Let's say Richard Pryor when I was 9 or 10. I didn't know what the hell, I didn't know what he was talking about. He was saying stuff that was way beyond me. But the first stand-up comedy special that I saw, start to finish, was Robert Klein. I would have been 10 years old, and Robert Klein is somebody my dad went to school with. They lived in the same general vicinity as one another in the Bronx. Yeah, Robert Klein's still around. He's 83 now. My dad was 79 when he passed. But that was a kind of PG-13 rated special. Klein was the sort of comic who would drop the occasional F-bomb. And he's also the answer to two trivia questions. First trivia question, who was the first stand-up comic to have his own special on HBO? Robert Klein. And who was the first person to drop an F-bomb on HBO legally, where he couldn't get in trouble in the way of George Carlin or Lenny Bruce getting arrested for saying however many words, the 7 words you can't say on TV. So I like Robert Klein, but I got enough of a little bit of a tease of Richard Pryor and more specifically George Carlin that I was interested in all stand-up comics. And there were nights where there would be like a Rodney Dangerfield young comedian special I also shouldn't have watched that I watched. And one particular special in 1987 featured a rising Brooklyn-style stand-up comic who went by Andrew Dice Clay. His last name was Silverstein. He was Andrew Clay Silverstein. But there were a lot of talented comics on the Young Comedian special where Dice appeared, including another fantastic, kind of underrated because he doesn't have the name, Robert Schimmel. Robert Schimmel was an absolute boss. He was a phenomenal comic. But on the same special as Robert Schimmel, you also had Andrew Dice Clay. Dom Herrera also, a lot of big hitters, Barry Sobel. The Dice Man, though, went out there and he killed. He had a 10-minute set, and he was so good in his set, it was similar to, I think, 2 years prior, where Sam Kinison just destroyed. He fucking destroyed. He went out there and he had an idea. It's the famous bit that you may have seen on TikTok where Kinison starts talking about how to solve world hunger, and he just lets it rip. We think he's going in a different direction than the bit ends up landing, and it is just gold. So Dice, on his appearance in the Young Comedian special, he also just destroyed every bit. His timing is impeccable. The line readings, the exaggerated accent, everything is just perfect. And I, not so surprisingly, found that many of my classmates had seen the special. And then sometime later, Dice got another special. I forgot what it was called, but it focused more on his, he had these sort of dirty nursery rhymes, if you will. Jack and Jill went up the hill, both with $1.25. Jill came down with $2.50. He had a whole, dozens of these. So I was a fan. And when it was announced, I guess sometime in 1989, that he was going to star in a regular motion picture, I was excited. I was hoping to, maybe see the film in theaters. Back to the Future 3, another terrific film from summer 1990. I'm going to probably remember movies from that summer. I think Air America with Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr. didn't do that well. Was also summer of 1990. I know Mel did Macbeth that year also. But I was excited to see the guy on the big screen. I would have been, 16 as the summer of 1990 unfolded. And I ended up not seeing it. I ended up not seeing Ford Fairlane in theaters. It just didn't work out, and I didn't have the sort of freedom of movement. I was a kid. I didn't have a driver's license. And the nearest movie theater at the time, I was living in Massapequa, was the Sunrise Mall Theater, which was 3 miles away. And, there's no Uber. It was a completely different world. And I also was working. I was working that summer. I worked for my father. That was my second summer working for my dear old dad. So you had, let's say, a 90-minute commute in, a 90-minute commute out. Didn't have as much free time as I would in other summers. But Dad and I did see Die Hard 2 earlier in the summer, as I said, also directed by Rennie Harlan. And saw Back to the Future 3 with my sister and my father as well. So it was a good summer. I also got sick. I ended up getting the chicken pox. That took me out of action for a couple of weeks. It's kind of funny, as a part of the generation where there was no vaccine for chicken pox. We just got the chicken pox, or we didn't. And knowing what we know about shingles, glad I got it. I don't even want to think about it, because I know people who never had chicken pox and then developed shingles in their 50s. Not pleasant, not pretty, a lot worse than the very mild case of chicken pox that I was stricken with. I didn't even get sick. I didn't have a temperature. My energy was fine. I just, I was a little itchy for about a day and a half, but I stayed away. I stayed home for as long as the doctors recommended. The scabs and all that nonsense, gross. They all came off. And then we got back to our regularly scheduled, summer programming. But The Adventures of Ford Fairlane did not light up the box office. It got some decent reviews. And I remember reading articles before the film came out where Clay discussed the movie and, the general idea of the plot. He said there's a nice musical component, and they put a really good cast around you. He was not in character as the Dice Man during the interviews, which I saw. There was a featurette on HBO that aired during that summer. He was very candid and open, and he came across like a guy who wanted to break into the movie business, not necessarily as the Dice Man, because he had been in a film with Leah Thompson. Speaking of Back to the Future, Leah Thompson, of course, plays Lorraine Baines McFly in the Back to the Future trilogy. Leah Thompson and the Saturday Night Live terrific comic performer Victoria Jackson, they made a movie called Casual Sex, it was filmed not long after Dice's fantastic showing on, and the Rodney Dangerfield Young Comedian special. The movie's not good. I really like Leah Thompson, and Victoria Jackson gets a few laughs. She's funny, and Dice is the highlight of the film. He plays a character who is like the Dice character. He's known as the Vin Man. But his character has an interesting little move to him, kind of an arc, and the story has, for a movie called Casual Sex, it has a good message. And you could see in that film that the former Andrew Clay Silverstein was somebody who was going to often be better than the material, and in some ways, maybe even better than his own material. That he just has really good timing. And not everyone has it. You could be a terrific stand-up comic and not have the timing for movies. It's all different. And there were critics who did not like Adventures of Ford Fairlane, such as my favorite critic, Roger Ebert. And you could go check his review to make sure I'm not telling you a fish story here. Roger Ebert did not like Ford Fairlane. I'm pretty sure that Gene Siskel also thumbs down. But he said the movie is not ready for prime time, but Clay is. And Ebert pointed out this is a very incendiary, he's a polarizing comic. Some people love him. A lot of people think that he really shouldn't be allowed to do the stuff that he does. Some of the outlandish, kind of, not even borderline offensive, outlandish offensive stuff that is big cornerstone of his act. But Ebert said, this guy is talented. Don't let the fact that he is maybe a sort of stand-up comic that you think shouldn't exist. He is a talented performer, and he's really good in this movie. It's just the story lets him down. So when Dice, in the interviews and the press tour, talked about the really great people that he had working with him, he was able to cast somebody that he knew from the stand-up circuit, a fucking legend himself, Gilbert Gottfried. And just as an aside, speaking of Gilbert Gottfried, unfortunately he passed a couple of years ago, but I mentioned Robert Klein. And Robert Klein told a story about Gilbert Gottfried once, where there was a movie that Robert Klein, because Robert Klein wasn't just a stand-up comic, similar to Dice, he broke into mainstream films and had some pretty good roles in a number of big movies. Like he played one of the chiefs of staff in Primary Colors with John Travolta. He has a couple of really good scenes with Travolta in that film. But Robert Klein told a story about Gilbert Gottfried, where the two of them were in a movie with Jennifer Tilly called Goosed, where Robert Klein was cast as Jennifer Tilly's father. And he's the father, and I think she's getting married, but she's presented as like a nymphomaniac or something. I don't remember the exact mechanics, but it was something like that. So Robert Klein jokingly says stuff to the effect that I play her father. Every single male actor under 70 in the cast, his character has sex with Jennifer Tilly's character. Every single character except me, because I play her father. And then Robert Klein pauses and leans into the microphone and shouts, Gilbert Gottfried nails her. And they cut immediately to Gilbert Gottfried laughing his ass off in the crowd. Well, Gilbert Gottfried was always the kind of comic that would rub some people the wrong way because of his unusual line delivery. I saw The Last Temptation of Christ. He dies at the end. Oh, I spoiled the movie for you. My favorite Gilbert Gottfried bit right there. I spoiled The Last Temptation of Christ. He dies at the end. Great stuff. But Gilbert Gottfried plays someone who worked with Dice Clay's Ford Fairlane. That's the name of Dice's character in the film, The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. He's the title character. So Gilbert Gottfried plays a music DJ who was in a band with Ford Fairlane, and we get the idea that they were somewhat successful. But he works as a detective now. He's a rock and roll detective. He's somebody that'll throw down and do a musical number in the middle of nowhere. The film at times almost feels like a musical because there are these strange musical interludes. You have Ed O'Neill. I mean, Ed O'Neill is the highlight of this movie, if you ask me. He's fucking hilarious. He plays an actual detective who has beef with Ford Fairlane because Ed O'Neill's character had this musical group that sucked, or in the words of Ford Fairlane, they blew dog, and he didn't promote them because he thought they were terrible. So Ed O'Neill has issues with Ford Fairlane, and he's looking for this missing heiress or something. The plot is not important. This is a showcase for some of Andrew Dice Clay's actual shtick. But what Roger Ebert and other critics who didn't like the film were talking about, Rex Reed, another critic, he didn't really think the movie was that good, but he thought that Clay was. Very similar kind of review to Roger Ebert. But he does some of his shtick, but you can also see that he's trying to develop this character. That he is not just set up punchline. It's not just a series of one-liners or sight gags, or because he has plenty of moments where he, humiliates other characters. But the movie is not just that. He's trying to craft a three-dimensional character. I would say he almost gets there. The story really does let him down. It's very well shot, and some other big names in supporting performances. Priscilla Presley, who was very hot. She was in between the two Naked Gun movies. She's fucking funny in this film, too. There's a kind of show-stopping scene where Ford is attempting to size her up, and he's not sure if she's a femme fatale or not, similar to how her character is originally presented in the first Naked Gun. And by way of almost introducing herself to Ford Fairlane, she goes, when I was 10 years old, I walked in on my father and my Shetland pony. Does that excite you? And Dice goes, I don't know. I never met your father. No, they're just absolute gold. Another casting masterstroke. Well, there's two more. I mean, this movie was so perfectly cast. It's worth seeing just to check out the supporting players and who shows up in what kind of role. So I guess you could say he's sort of the villain of the film, but for most of the movie, he doesn't really feel like the villain. There's a character, a music industry mogul, like a big Berry Gordy type, named Julian Grendel, and it's played by Mr. Vegas himself, Wayne Newton. Now, when I first saw this film, I rented it from Blockbuster when I was 17, when it first hit. I'm sorry, I taped it off a pay-per-view, and I must have seen this film 30 times, just kept watching the tape in an endless loop. So I didn't understand who Wayne Newton was or why he was a big deal. I didn't get that he was Mr. Vegas, that this guy already had the record for most consecutive sellouts in Vegas, and that he was a resident entertainer, whether it was at Caesars or the MGM Grand. I don't remember exactly where he was performing at that time. I just thought he was an actor and that he was funny. It's an in-joke, the fact that Mr. Vegas, the great entertainer, Wayne Donka Shane, like that guy playing a scumbag music industry mogul, like that's pretty meta. It's pretty meta, and it's something that now you pick up on. It adds another layer to the proceedings. Another villain is played by Freddy Krueger himself, Robert Englund. And this one I got the joke. The fact that, what do we know about Freddy Krueger? He can't be killed. In the immortal words of Dan Aykroyd, in the various Nightmare on Elm Street movies, he's poisoned, shot, stabbed, hung, stretched, disemboweled, drawn and quartered, blown up, burned to a crisp. But like the Energizer Bunny, he just keeps on coming. That's what she said. But in the world of this film, Robert Englund's character gets killed at least 3 or 4 times. And he and Dice have a showdown that does not go at all the way that we think it will. And it's a top 10 favorite moments of the early 90s for me, because it's sort of, the showdown doesn't transpire the way that we think it will. Dice, who doesn't appear to necessarily be that intelligent as Ford Fairlane, outsmarts Robert Englund's bad guy. I forgot the guy's name. Just gold. It's like, this is the sort of movie that to me is 3 stars out of 4. Even with a very weak story. There's this character, this guy called Art Mooney. They're looking for, you want to talk about a product of its time, they're looking for a third CD that has all kinds of incriminating, information on it. They're looking for a CD, not a jump drive, not, something that you can airdrop, nothing. An actual physical CD. And there's a running gag with Jimi Hendrix's guitar, for a left-handed wizard. It is fun to just see how Dice relates to the other characters, and that he doesn't hog the screen. Like, there are moments where you can see him basically ceding the spotlight. I forgot about Lauren Holly. Lauren Holly, for a time in the mid-90s, it looked like she was going to become a full-fledged star. She's really good in the movie Sabrina, the remake with Harrison Ford and Greg Kinnear. Fantastic. Angie Dickinson and Richard Crenna in supporting roles. And John Wood from War Games, another, British actor that I really like. He plays Sabrina's mom in the world of that film. Not mom, Sabrina's father. Good movie. And Lauren Holly's performance in Ford Fairlane, it's a thankless role, but she makes the most of it. She has a great face for the movies. And I enjoy her performance. She plays Jazz. That's Ford's assistant. And another irony before I close this episode. Not long before COVID, in 2019, and this was, I think, before the revival of Roseanne, the TV show. In 2019, Andrew Dice Clay and Roseanne Barr, I think she may have, just for this, brought her original name, Roseanne Barr, but I'm not sure about that. But Andrew Dice Clay and Roseanne went on tour, for stand-up comedy. Roseanne wanted to get back to her roots also. Again, that's not a judgment. There's nothing wrong with that. It was called the Mr. and Mrs. America Tour. And I remember when they played the Paramount, I think they only played one night, and the line was around the block. No exaggeration. And from what I can gather, just off of social media, it was a good show. The gist I got was that Roseanne, her timing wasn't quite there. She hadn't really done this very much. And Dice had, kind of continued touring, even if he wasn't as big a deal as he had been, let's say, circa 1990 during the Dice Rules era. But he apparently was great. And I didn't read from anybody who didn't think that the show was terrific. The reason why I even brought that up, not just for the, kind of more recent context, but the fact that he and Roseanne worked together and had a good working relationship from what we can gather during that tour. Now, not that they were hanging out, but that they were professional acquaintances and professional friends, and neither tried to steal the spotlight from the other. It was apparently a pretty good show. In Adventures of Ford Fairlane, there is a very early scene in the film where Ford wakes up with two hot girls. Because he's Mr. Rock and Roll Detective, he gets all of by his own words, he gets all the hottest chicks. So he has these two girls, they're getting ready to, leave his house, and here comes Lauren Holly in the long-suffering role of his assistant, Jazz. And the two girls leave the house, and she's going over with Ford what he has on the ledger today. It's going to be a busy day. Some of the stuff that we then see in the movie. There's a couple of side stories which don't really pay off. But one of the things, there is a famous rocker named Bobby Black who has passed. He has to go to the funeral, whatever this shit that's going on. But he is very clearly aroused. It is a sight gag that I don't think would fly anymore. That's also not a criticism. He is still very aroused. And she calls attention to it, and the way that Andrew Dice Clay's Ford Fairlane gets himself back to baseline, he goes, Roseanne Barr naked, gone. Now, I like to think that the Dice Man in 2019 apologized for that and we can make all the Roseanne jokes we want. She's this, she's horrible. I'm not here to judge. That joke is inappropriate regardless. I don't even think that she had done that when she sang the Star Spangled Banner poorly, and that whole thing where H.W. Bush got involved and he said it was a disgrace. That was just unbelievable that George H.W. Bush got into that controversy. But I don't know. I wonder if he apologized for that. Or, in comedy, all's fair, right? They're in the business of making people laugh. Sometimes you're going to be insulting. You're going to step on people's toes. The Adventures of Ford Fairlane is not really as insulting as it could be. It takes a few shots. There's a Clint Eastwood joke, which I think even Clint probably thought was funny because also kind of comes out of nowhere. But it's just a movie. It's a product of its time. Dice with the hair from the late 80s era and the outlandish costumes, the bright colors, and the fact that we just kind of go along on this not very exciting, not very earth-shattering journey with a guy who would end up becoming a pretty good film actor, and I remember in Blue Jasmine, the Woody Allen film from 2013, there was a lot of Oscar buzz. Many big hitters in the industry said, we think that Dice, crazy as it seems, he might get a supporting actor nod. He didn't. And then he played Gaga's father in the Star is Born remake. He doesn't have as big a role in that as he does in Blue Jasmine. But again, many people were saying words to the effect of, it's hard to believe that this guy used to be this wacky, incendiary stand-up comic. If you didn't know, you would think he was just a film actor all along, because he's really good at hitting his marks and not stepping on anyone's toes, not jumping on anyone's line. He has a good face. He reacts well, all of that. 35 years ago today, on this day, 1990, Rennie Harlin's second blockbuster. The first one really was a blockbuster. This was an attempt at a blockbuster that didn't quite land with audiences. The Adventures of Ford Fairlane opened in theaters, directed by Rennie Harlin and starring Andrew Clay Silverstein, aka Andrew Dice Clay, Lauren Holly, Ed O'Neill, Priscilla Presley, Robert Englund, and Wayne Newton. This has been episode 579 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Friday afternoon here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.